Today, we're talking about changing the narrative of HIV. And there's so much stigma in every conversation that we've had. Stigma seems to be the revolving focal point in all of these chats. And today, I'm joined by Nathaniel Hall, an HIV activist, as well as a fabulous actor. Nathaniel, welcome. How are you?
I'm fine. Thank you, Raif. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well. Thank you so much for joining me and for sharing your story and all the work that you're doing. I think it's amazing. Okay, so in your autobiographical stage theater show called First Time, you talk about living with HIV, diagnosis, and the stigma that you faced. How was that for you when you were diagnosed, and how has that changed over time?
Well, when I was diagnosed, terrifying. I was diagnosed back in 2003. We're going back nearly 20 years now. So I was just 16. I was still a child, and I'd met someone who was older than me on a park bench. It was. Such a middle class boy, like I was head boy at my school, straight A student, and it was kind of my act of rebellion. But also as well, I grew up in a world in the UK that was really quite homophobic, although I didn't realize at the time. And representation of queer people and LGBTQ people on screen and in music was quite poor, actually. And newspapers were sort of outing people in the press and scandal. And there was this legislation called Section 28, which stopped schools talking openly about homosexuality. And I remember in our sex ed class, the only stuff we had on sort of gay relationships and gay sex was this really out-of-date video of this guy that was dying from AIDS, this gay guy. And it was the first time I'd ever seen someone who I knew I was deep inside on screen. And it was such a negative first formative experience. And I remember sitting there, it was like Coach Carr in Mean Girls, just not funny. It's like not chlamydia this time. It's like, don't be gay, you'll get AIDS and die. And then the prophecy came true. I met this guy, we had this sort of summer romance, and looking back, I was groomed. He was 10 years older than me, and my parents kind of called it off, and as a result of that, by the end of that year, in the November, 2 weeks before my 17th birthday, I was sat in a clinic, being diagnosed with HIV, and it was incredibly powerful, the layers of stigma and shame and self-stigma and shame linked to gay sex and my identity, and that idea that I'd kind of just become the stereotype in a sense. So I just shut down and I just didn't tell people, and until 15 years later, fast forward, I'm living what I think is my best queer life, but actually really in denial. I'm in a toxic relationship. I'm not addicted to, but I'm really heavily leaning on drugs and alcohol and sex parties, the lot, like such a stereotype, and not a place I ever thought I'd end up. But actually I realized at that point it was this this self-stigma and this self-shame that had eaten away at my sense of self-worth, and that something had to change. And that's why I went on this journey to tell my story.
Yeah, I totally relate to you talking about this self-fulfilling prophecy. And I remember when I was coming out, I was originally, like not embracing being gay, and I was going to go through conversion therapy, and that's a whole other story. But when I decided to embrace being gay finally, I remember my mom sat me down and she was so worried and upset. And she just sternly told me, you're going to end up with AIDS and you're going to die. And I think jail was in there somewhere too. But so yeah, it was like, and then it's like, wow, yeah, she was right. That was like my realization, like, great, she was right. And I'm a failure.
And it shows you, doesn't it? Like the stigma of that. The great sadness for me is that when my mum sat me down and had that conversation, not known to her or me was that actually I already had HIV. But I think that shows you the depth of the cultural and stigmas that are in place that kind of control these conversations.
Yeah, exactly. And part of that, and I want to touch in to healthcare and individualized healthcare, and how stigma can be just as pervasive there as well from a medical perspective. And having that individualized care is so important in developing a relationship with your patient and rechanging the narrative in that sense. Because I know when I was diagnosed, immediately I thought I was going to be dead in 2 to 3 years. I had AIDS at the time. And it took someone sitting down with me and having that not just physician to patient relationship, but like it was a maternal relationship, to be honest, with my doctor. She was wonderful. And she really took the time to sit down with me and connect with me on an emotional level. I'm curious what your perspective is on that and what was your experience like?
Well, I was very lucky when I was diagnosed. I had one of the UK's leading HIV experts as my doctor, which was really nice. And he was, he'd worked in HIV healthcare right from the start, really, and was very knowledgeable, very wise, and knew exactly how to hold his patients. He was such a wonderful man, and he had this way of making you feel relaxed. I'd come in with all these anxieties. I'm going traveling. What do I do when I start? Do I take my medication at which time zone? And it was like he had this way and this manner of going and making me feel really comfortable and safe because I knew that he was really knowledgeable. I always say, and actually a friend of mine, Yvonne, who lives with HIV, she says the same. When you go back to that clinic, even if it's a different one, you go back to that place of diagnosis. And you go, even though I'm like, I've talked, to people across the world about HIV, and I've stood on stages, like yourself, and talked on screen and all sorts. I go in from my doctor and I'm 16 again and I can't think straight. And my mind goes blank and my palms are sweaty. And I'm like, when I come out and I go, why? Like, I know my doctor, she's really nice. But actually, it's because the trauma and the PTSD in those triggers all come back. So I think doctors need to be really aware of that and how they can just structure their conversation to try and maybe kind of eke out and get under the skin of maybe what their patient is thinking or feeling.
Yeah, we've had a previous discussion. HIV is still a thing, and that's, you touched on that in a great way, because even in the patient doctor relationship, it needs to be addressed that HIV is still a thing, and therefore we can't just routinize all aspects of healthcare. We do need to still check up and say, how's it going in school? How's it going with your family? You told me last time, your dog was sick. How's your dog doing? Those kinds of relationships and the conversations that I had with my HIV care is still really relevant today.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so important, and it takes I think one thing I've realized as I've, become a little bit mature in my diagnosis over the last few years, having come out and been public about it, is that I realized that my well-being needs around my HIV healthcare and beyond, and my mental well-being needs, are complex, and actually it needs a lot of people to kind of care for me. We all do, whether we have HIV or not, but actually it's my responsibility. And I make sure that if I can see the old triggers, the old things, the old anxieties bubbling up, it's my job to learn how to kind of cope with them. But your doctor can be the person that can help you do that and can help refer you to, counseling support, EMDR therapy, whatever it is that you need. And it's so important that doctors remember that they're kind of often the key to that with patients, because they're often so terrified when they go into the clinic, even if they're long HIV.
I have to emphasize it's really important, especially for people living with HIV. I mean, if you go in with diabetes, you're not at the same time worried about your place in society or other people knowing, or there's so much stigma that just isn't prevalent with other manageable chronic conditions. I remember, I want to bring this up. There was a time when I went to go see a doctor, and he did something so simple as taking off his glove and then touching my hand. And I just was like, it almost brings tears in my eyes now just thinking about it, because it was so moving for me. It made me feel human. So things like that. Shifting gears a little bit, I want to talk about healthcare as it relates to HIV, and specifically individualized healthcare. Why is that important, in particular for the HIV community?
Well, I think, everyone living with HIV is totally different, and HIV is the one thing that unites us, and that we have this shared virus, but actually the way that it impacts us is totally different, and that is not only biologically in terms of like the medications that people respond to and stuff, and you work on that with your with your physician or whatever, but it's in terms of how it impacts our psychological well-being. I know people who are diagnosed with HIV and it just really doesn't bother them, and I'm in awe. I'm like, give me what are you taking? Like, what is this thing? And they're just like, it's happened, I have my pill, I'm not bothered, and they just get on with their life. And for me, it was the total opposite. It had a really profound impact. It was tied up with as I realized going on to make the show, reflecting back on my past, that I was groomed, that I was put into sexual into positions that I shouldn't have been, and in terms of being sort of maybe not consenting to sex. So there was so much to unpick there, and so much shame around
Mm.
that. And I think it's around that for me. It's around those specific stigmas that intersect with our identity. So me as a white cisgendered gay man from the UK is very, very different to like a black British woman in the UK, or an African American woman, or or an ex-injecting drug user. We all have.
Nathaniel, can you speak a little bit about what your experience was living with HIV and the medication and the impact on your mental health, and how you feel about it moving forward today? What's the difference, if there is any?
Oh, a massive difference. I mean, if you think to go in, this is my teenage bedroom. I'm actually sat in it because I still moved back in with my parents, actually just before the COVID pandemic, which was a wise move. But this was the room of secrets. So this is the room where I hid my appointment cards. In fact, I think they're like stuck behind the wardrobe, between the wardrobe and the wall, where I used to throw them because I didn't want anyone to find them. This is the room where when I first got medication, I had to bring it in and try and find a place to hide it from people and take it on the sly. And that has a profound impact on you, and this fear that someone will find those things, and kind of confront you with the reality of what you're going through. But then if we fast forward to now, when we think about the advent of PrEP, pre-exposure prophylaxis, which is the meds that people can take preemptively to stop them getting HIV if they're at risk, which is really highly effective, and U equals U, so people that on effective medication can't pass it on. These two incredible tools, which I guess were moving along, like my show kind of rode on the back of these waves of kind of positivity and this kind of confidence, I think, in people living with HIV to kind of go, hang on a sec, we're not a danger. We never were, but we now have the receipts.
Yeah.
But I always found that it was my responsibility to have that conversation with partners, to go to have the condoms or not, do I disclose, etc., etc. And actually,
that's not easy.
Well, no, exactly. And it's the weight of responsibility is left to us, the people with HIV, to kind of manage. And my current partner, who actually saw my show, so he knew I was HIV positive, but we were dating and chatting, and it was clear that it was going somewhere. And actually, he totally blindsided me by bringing it up in conversation before I had. And he just went, I'm on PrEP. And I was like, I nearly cried. I actually held it in, but I was like, that was one of the most transformative moments of my life, when I realized how much of the weight of responsibility I had been carrying, and instantly just took all that baggage off. And I think if we talk about allyship, one of the ways in which people can be great allies is learning the tools to handle that conversation as well. So it's not always our responsibility.
Between PrEP and U equals U, it's really about self-empowerment and taking control of our own sexual health.
Absolutely, yeah. And I really, really encourage other people to be actively engaged before they contract something, because it's so much easier to prevent than it is to then have to try and manage or cure.
That's right. Well, I think that's a great place to cap it off. I love your energy. It's such a positive way of looking at it moving forward. And I just hope that other people really feel that sense of self-empowerment and hope for the future that you have exuded in your performances and just chatting with you right now. So thank you to everyone at home for watching. It's been a pleasure. Nathaniel Hall, thank you so much for being vulnerable and open and sharing your story as always. And we'll see you in the next episode of HIV in View. If you haven't seen other episodes, please note that they are available to watch on ViiV Healthcare's YouTube page. All right, we'll see you soon. Cheers.